Welcome, everyone. So this is a special webinar from the SADS Foundation in recognition of Mental Health Awareness Month of May. I'm Marcia Baker, the Program Director of the SADS Foundation. On behalf of the entire team at SADS, we're glad you could join us for this webinar and learn about the Japanese concept IKIGAI. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our special guest presenter, friend and colleague of the SADS Foundation, Dr. Sam Sears. Dr. Sears is a clinical health psychologist and professor at East Carolina University, jointly appointed in the departments of psychology and cardiovascular sciences. He is internationally recognized for his work in the psychological care of patients with cardiac conditions, particularly those with implantable cardioverter defibrillators, ICDs, and genetic heart conditions like long QT syndrome, CPVT, Brugada syndrome, and arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. Dr. Sears is passionate about helping patients and families cope with the emotional challenges of living with inherited heart conditions and integrating mental well-being into cardiac care. After Sam's presentation, you'll have the chance to put your questions in the chat, and we'll address as many of those as possible. Sam, I'll turn it over to you now to tell us more about Ikigai.
Thanks, Marcia. Thank you for that introduction. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. This SADS group is just simply an amazing group. I've followed this organization for my entire career, and hats off to the Ikigai that goes with so many of each of your work. Well, as a psychologist and professor for the last 30 years, I've certainly been interested in learning. Learning is my day-to-day job, and wisdom can be gained all around the world. Tonight's talk comes from my experiences in Japan, in Tokyo, last summer, where I just got off a plane and said, give me something to eat, and I could recognize a couple English words in there, so I sat down and took this picture after 17 hours or whatever it is to get there. But Tokyo and Japan have some interesting psychological ideas for us, and we'll start with the very idea of Ikigai. That Ikigai is the Japanese word for a meaningful life. What does that even mean? What does a meaningful life mean? And that's what we want to pursue tonight and talk about Ikigai. Ikigai was first brought to the West basically by accident. That researchers were looking at where in the world people lived at higher percentages of up to 90 and to 100 years of age. And they identified these areas called blue zones. And specifically blue zones were places where people lived long, and they wanted to know why. Why would people live so long? And Ikigai was one of the ideas brought about. And the reason is because Okinawa, Japan, was one of the places that was considered a blue zone. Blue zones were also identified in the other regions on the map here. You can see Loma Linda was the only one in the United States that made it. Some people have suggested that's because of the high percentage of Seventh-day Adventists who tend to have a pretty healthy lifestyle. I don't know if that's really been exactly shown, but that's one of the hypothesized ideas. But this idea about why do people live so long in Japan got people thinking about what's unique about this culture in Okinawa, and specifically Ikigai was pointed to or credited for these longer lives. Well, later it became a U.S. bestseller, the idea of Ikigai and the Japanese secret to a long life, and today we debate blue zones. They continue to be in the literature, and we continue to talk about blue zones, but nobody's quite sure what exactly accounts for blue zones. But Ikigai is certainly a compelling idea that I think we can use tonight as we think about living with heart disease. And many of my comments will come from this little book called My Little Ikigai Journal, this really paperback, small journal that challenges people to think about the elements of Ikigai, and we'll look at this carefully as we go. We'll talk about each of these components, about passions, values, gifts, and possibilities. Because this very idea about what do you love? How do you see the world? Where can you make a difference? And what do you excel at? Is an important challenge with or without heart disease. Every one of us can find meaningfulness, or according to Ikigai, a meaningful life, by trying to understand these components. And it prompts the question, what is your Ikigai? What brings meaningfulness to your life? these questions can be almost trite at times, where people go, well, I like to parasail off a mountaintop or something. But the idea about what is Ikigai is deeper than that, and really has to do with what are the experiences in your life where when you do them, you're fully engaged, you're fully present, and you recognize that the work there or the activities there are meaningful. Because that really is a hard thing to answer. What is meaningful? Because it's different for all of us, right? And that's actually the beauty of it, is that something meaningful for one may not be meaningful for others, and on and on. Now, some people say, hey man, okay, thanks for telling me what Ikigai was, but I really don't have time for this nonsense. I'm trying hard already. Do you know what it's like to be me? I mean, most days are really challenging, and you asking me to try to find what's meaningful, to somehow find some peak of experience, is annoying. I get that. It reminds me of this. Sharpen. I have no time to sharpen my axe. I'm busy trying to cut trees. And that's what it can feel like psychologically, trying to manage, the process of growing up, the process of raising families, the process of going to school, and wondering about your well-being and your health. Because the challenge really is your heart condition. And that's the reason in many ways for SADS and for even tonight's seminar is, how do we maintain a focus on the important parts of psychological health while also dealing with real challenges that most people don't have and most people don't even understand, of isolation or loneliness or uncertainty that some others may not understand. And as you know, heart disease in our young patients and our young families often occurs in the context of grief. So chasing Ikigai when you're hurting about who you've lost is ridiculous. And so it is the case that when we talk about worry and ambiguity and grief, there are significant emotional challenges that go along with living with heart disease. That the emotional processes, both positive and negative, that go with living with heart disease are quite unique experiences. The challenges of what you think and you feel, and trying to look ahead and forecast the future and worry, but not worry, but then get ready for the future, but don't worry too much about the future, to try to live in the present, but also plan for the future, to worry about the other people you love, it ends up being crazy. And it prompts some degree, in my view, about the need for self-awareness, kind of like this guy who's clearly self-aware. He says, would you believe it? My neighbor was knocking on the door at 2:30 this morning. Luckily, I was still up playing my bagpipes. That's the very idea about knowing how you're doing, knowing how you're coming across. That self-awareness does, in fact, matter. And while this guy kind of blew it in a way, self-awareness matters. Even Taylor Swift thinks self-awareness matters in her famous song Anti-Hero. And in this video, you can see that Taylor Swift says, I'll stare directly in the sun, but never in the mirror. Suggesting that looking away from oneself, being distracted by anything, is better than trying to self-analyze or self-reflect. And that's true for a lot of people. That alone that's not pathologic per se, but it certainly is the idea that sometimes thinking about who we are and how we spend our time can be humbling. I mean, recently I got one of those things at the end of the week about how many hours I had spent on my phone. I don't know if you guys get these little notifications. And I got to tell you, I looked at that and I thought, my God, I've spent that much time on my phone per day this week. That is sick. I mean, really, it's like, there's no way I blew that much time. I can't get that back, that's for sure. But staring directly in the sun, I'll stare directly in the sun, but never in the mirror, is an interesting idea from Taylor Swift, and would be challenging to the process of achieving Ikigai. So what do we do about Ikigai? We'll talk about these blue passions, values, gifts, and possibilities. See, I've always said this. From the beginning of my time as a psychologist in cardiology, now 30 years I've been in practice, I believe that heart disease produces a special knowledge. That heart patients in particular learn to value what they have more than other people. They learn to prioritize life differently, and I think we have to use that as a special dividend, a special knowledge, a special return. And we have some data for this. This is an older study. But then this study, they looked at the way in which people after breast cancer or after a heart attack, what they changed years later. And you can see that the black bars are breast cancer patients. So, for example, the biggest change for a breast cancer patient was improved close relationships. But besides a healthy lifestyle change for heart patients, look at the second one, greater appreciation of life. The data really supports this idea of a special knowledge being gained from everything being at risk. And it reminds me of this pottery I found in Japan, kintsugi. Kintsugi is an interesting pottery, isn't it? Look at that. It's kind of strange, right? I mean, who wants broken pottery? Everyone. Kintsugi is the Japanese word for gold repair. Specifically, kintsugi is the embracing of imperfection. That this art was found when a samurai warrior broke a bowl and wanted it fixed. He sent it out, and it came back with a mixture of lacquer and gold to create the repair. And the important part about this is that the cracks are seen as the features, that the beauty is in the brokenness of it, that in the repair there's more beauty than in the perfection. And it makes for unique bowls. Nobody could have the same one. And making beauty from challenges, it's an interesting idea. Overcoming cracks, making cracks better, is an important principle for all of us psychologically. You know, in the US, we'd probably just get us a shirt that said, like, boom, nice try, here I am, deal with thee. All right, we got a little more swag. We're not going to talk about bowls. We're going to talk about how we're, bad dudes, right? We're able to overcome things. And there is a little bit of special knowledge even in this shirt. In this shirt, it's like, hey, I'm still here. I am going to pursue Ikigai anyway. So tonight I want to talk about 3 aspects of Ikigai. We'll talk about first an update from cardiac psychology. What is it that we're seeing in the current literature? What are the updates that we know from psychologic science and science around patients with defibrillators and other kinds of arrhythmic conditions? We'll talk about Ikigai 101 and then finally wind up talking about a case study about Hachiko. So the first and foremost idea is cardiac psychology is, we have some more recent data now that suggests that about 38% of patients with arrhythmic conditions, in this case channelopathies like long QT, that 38% of our patients experiencing diagnosable anxiety and about 16% experience depression. This, of course, means that approximately 1 in 3 people on this call deal with anxiety frequently. And our data from our work together with Stanford showed that PTSD in parents was particularly surprising. In this study, we had 50 kids and 43 parents that matched to them. And we showed that 47% had PTSD symptoms that were significant, and 12% of the kids reported PTSD symptoms that was significant. What that means is not the diagnosis in this case, but the symptoms that would amount to that kind of diagnosis. Diagnosis can't be done on self-report. It can only be described by self-report. But nonetheless, you're talking about almost half of all parents going through a degree of anxiety that's quite unusual. Of course, PTSD is marked by recurrent and intrusive thoughts of fear, recurrent and intrusive nightmares, strong avoidance of content associated with this fear, and hyperarousability, difficulty sleeping, somatic symptoms that go along with this kind of avoidance of content. And Jody Engel's group, although this is an older study, it's an important one about as many as 1 in 5 families dealing with prolonged grief, that losing someone you love, particularly a young person you love, is not something you get over easily. It's something that actually grief has a way of sneaking back in. You sort of lock it out of your house and it comes in the side door sometimes. So grief is another significant challenge. More recently, we have a big meta-analysis now available. It took a lot of our studies and others, 109 studies, almost 40,000 patients. Now, with ICDs studied across all of these studies, and you see the rates of anxiety about 22% for anxiety, 15% for depression, and again, that 12% number showing up for ICD patients. Interestingly, spouses also had the same rate of anxiety or depression, 22%. So again, 1 in 5 of our patients experiencing some sort of anxiety or depression that's problematic, that's intrusive and invasive and frustrating and annoying and difficult to just simply kick out of the way, but tends to linger and create some disturbance. And for those of you with ICDs, you know that wondering about your ICD, wondering about being shocked, about 44% of patients with ICDs having regular concerns about shock anxiety. And that leads to all kinds of things like avoiding activities and exertion as a way, not a proper way or not an effective way, but a way to somehow try to avoid ever activating your heart or activating your device. This, of course, doesn't work. That's not how the heart works, but it's completely reasonable for many patients to want to avoid some of these things. Now, one question that comes up from a scientific perspective is, well, can I cause a shock? I mean, does anxiety and depression, what if I have anxiety and depression? I mean, am I going to get shocked more? And the answer from this study with 35,000 ICD patients and 37 studies is that there's no link between anxiety and ICD shocks. No link. So you can't make yourself anxious enough to get a shock. But anxiety and depression was linked to worse outcomes. Now, what that means is that anxiety and depression probably dragged along some other kinds of medical severity. And again, it's only correlational. They don't cause each other. They just simply, anxiety and depression tends to hang around and can lead to problems if we don't address it. Good news is you're not doomed by it in any way. Anxiety and depression are totally treatable, but it does require some treatment. And most recently, as last month, we got effectiveness studies for psychotherapy. Patients with ICDs, we had 9 randomized controlled trials reported it by Nick Manis and showed that, yes, anxiety does improve from psychotherapy. And this large-scale meta-analysis where they put all the studies together and melt them all down and showed that in the 3,300 patients who were enrolled in studies, they did, in fact, improve anxiety. And those of you that know my work a little bit know that I've been very focused on the disengagement process of anxiety, that I'm particularly concerned about patients with rhythmic disorders and ICDs withdrawing from all activities whatsoever. And while you may get those sort of ideas from healthcare providers, being able to move some still matters. Even ARVC patients who are encouraged not to engage in marathon type activities, they still have to move some, right? Because the body depends on movement. Nonetheless, disengaging physically, disengaging emotionally, perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable first effort. And anxiety also has a common response of, I'm anxious, so I'm going to stay home. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to give that speech. I'm not going to go to that party. I'm not going to be a part of anything that's fun. I'm going to stay home and because it's safe here. But those two efforts as vectors of both emotional and physical withdrawal are associated with the problem. And for example, a recent study showed that in a study where they gave people essentially a device that triggered them randomly throughout the day. This group of researchers had them essentially wear beepers or cell phones that they sent out a message and said, "What are you thinking about right now?" And they did this randomly throughout the day to a sample of heart patients. And they said, "What are you thinking about right now?" 48% of the time, 48% of the time, the patients who got rung said, "I'm worrying about my heart. I'm thinking about my heart." And the reason this matters is because that doesn't make it an anxiety disorder. It's not like, oh, refer them all to psychologic and psychiatric. That's not what we're doing. What we're saying is that the rank and file patient with heart disease, the rank and file person that has arrhythmic disorders, the rank and file person that has an ICD, that there's an intrusive thought process that's silent. That without this kind of weird methodology where you're randomly dialing people and finding out what they're thinking about, we wouldn't know this because that's not something that we don't have a way to find that out unless you told us. And yet this study helps us understand the burdens that go with fear. Fear is intrusive. Fear breaks down doors that we sometimes try to lock it out of. And while this study is not exactly the group we're talking about tonight, this is a heart failure study from a group of Australians. But I wanted to highlight something in this data. This is a study from 2024 last year. And you can see here that, down here is the percent of people who reported the fear, and it had to be moderately to severely distressing. And it says, not knowing how my family will cope was the number one, if something should happen to me, the number one concern. Not knowing how my family will cope if something should happen to me. And then you have becoming a burden, the two biggest anxieties for patients with heart failure. Now, again, not exactly the group we have tonight, but you can see some of these things that might be relevant, worrying about my condition getting worse. But remember, I'm talking about at this point this idea of disengagement. Well, look down here. The other things that came up prominent were avoiding activities that make my heart beat faster, avoiding situations and activities, being overly aware of my heart. But I think this means that these are the burdens that group of researchers were starting to catch on to, that you don't get the same sort of freedom from thought that other people might have. And we've talked a lot about this over the years. I've certainly given a few SADS webinars in my day, and we've talked about the idea of this, that research into coping has generally supported this serenity prayer, that God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. So having tactics to say, well, this is the hand I was dealt, this is the hand I'm going to play. But also the courage when you need to make changes to do that. So this was the hand I dealt, but now I'm going to do this to try to reduce its impact. But most importantly is the last part about the wisdom to know the difference, the wisdom to know that some stressors we have to manage the emotional response to, but some stressors we have to change, make the change happen. And separating these two, because we all want to somehow grab control of everything, and sometimes we have to let it be. Sometimes we have to let some things be, like kintsugi, that does have a crack, but there's recovery, and there is some repair anyway. These are very difficult to do at any age, let alone as a young person. I think there's some experience that comes with life and these challenges, but it doesn't make these challenges any easier. It just means that remembering that there are tactics, both active tactics as well as acceptance tactics, that are valuable. Because in my view, achieving quality of life is really, in fact, the end game. Quality of life is an achievement, not an entitlement. We can't give you quality of life. No one can. In fact, I think it matches IKIGAI in many ways, that activities that are fun and bring a closeness to each other, activities that bring awe, activities that bring peace. These are activities that are a part of a quality of living, a quality of life. And it's certainly there that we're going to pursue next. So, to sum up that last section, psychologic factors remain a powerful player in the daily experience of many patients dealing with heart problems and in the SADS populations. And so, seminars like tonight, talking with your doctors, talking with family, talking with people who love you and care about you about that process of living successfully matters. So what about Ikigai? What do we do about Ikigai? So in this section, we'll talk some about how do we achieve Ikigai based on the Japanese principles. Well, why should we care about this? Well, there's actually some data about this. The British Medical Journal Open actually published this paper recently. 29,000 men, 41,000 women in Japan. 19-year follow-up on cardiovascular risk factors. They wanted to know, well, does Ikigai matter? Is there evidence for this blue zone idea, at least in this case, heart zone idea? And after studying this large group of people and following them 19 years, greater ikigai was associated with less cardiovascular death. And it was more for men. Men had a greater association with their ikigai to being alive 19 years later. It was also stronger in unemployed men and women. That is, not having a job has a way of making people feel bad, but having ikigai seemed to help. That ikigai was able to provide some meaning. Now, what about Americans, right? That was the Japanese study. Well, we have American data too, published this last year. In this study, they followed people for 23 years, and they filled out questionnaires 23 years ago about how much life satisfaction they had, and how much purpose in life they had, and their own health. And they wanted to know, well, maybe just healthy people who feel healthy, when you go follow up on them 23 years later, maybe healthy people are right. Well, they followed almost 6,000 Americans in this study called the Midlife in U.S. study. And what they showed, of those three psychologic characteristics, purpose in life was the best predictor of survival. Life satisfaction and self-rated health were there, but purpose in life was the strongest, suggesting that the Japanese principle of ikigai might have some role here in the United States or here in Western society. And I think what we're getting at are some of the commonalities of living life and trying to find things that give our life purpose and meaning. It doesn't mean that those are the only things. It's not like you should smoke and then find your purpose in life. But it means that purpose in life has a role in how things turn out for us. And it makes us turn back to ikigai. So let's first look at, what do I love? What do I love as a part of ikigai? Passions and values are another way we might say what I love. Well, I mentioned early on about this idea that ikigai is associated with being fully engaged, that things that provide us with energy might be getting closer to ikigai, meaning that things that make us grateful, things that help us feel authentic, things that help us find nature. The Japanese have a word called forest bathing, which is with two words, forest bathing, which has to do with enveloping yourself in nature. And the very idea, the music we played early on, you could hear the sound of water, the principle of Japanese gardens, time in nature, deep breathing, that those things are energy giving. And so those are contrasted by idealizing past relationships or negative self-talk or overthinking things or even overconsumption of social media, which I have to admit I have to work on. So energy giving activities are things that are passions. So what does that mean? Well, I think the number one principle about this is that what do you do that when you do it, there's nothing else you want to be doing? I mean, you love doing that thing, whatever it is. And you find a way in which time flies because you're having fun. No principle is better captured of finding what was called the psychologitic flow, where you don't even have to think about what you're doing. You know how to do it, and it's encompassing. It's single tasking. It means that all of your faculties, all of your attentiveness, all of your sensibilities, your sensitivities are aligned in such a way to focus on what you're doing. You lose track of time completely because it's so different than the humdrum, sitting in traffic, or something like something that you do every day that's boring. Maybe it could be laundry or washing dishes or something. But finding a way in which washing dishes is a flow, to do it well, to clean a kitchen in a certain way. Wow, that's silly, and it really is silly. But it means that flow is this idea that in which you're in your top mental state. You're productive, you're focused, you're creative. I like to think about people's phones as a way to do that. It's like I once had a professor at the University of Florida who gave people those throwaway phones back in the day. And the purpose of his work was basically to say, he gave everybody in the class a throwaway phone, those little plastic ones. Some of you don't even know what those are probably. But they were these little phones in which they had one roll of film, and people could go around and take pictures of anything they wanted. And what he did was he developed them all, and then he brought back the pictures and tried to make a sense about who that person was based on what they took pictures of. Well, the very thing is even easier now with a cell phone in which we can take pictures and look through your pictures. Take time to see, go back and say, what are you focused on? What are the passions that are represented in those pictures? Who's in them? Where are you? What are you doing? Because that probably gives us a clue about the kinds of passions we have. The passions for people, the passions for activities, the passion for places. But truly those pictures mean something. And I think that's a really interesting modern idea that compares with the Japanese culture of being all in where you are. A lot of people say, well, what about this? I mean, what are you a fan of? What would people say that you're a fan of? What does fan mean? Fanatic, right? So what are you a fanatic of? What do you love to do? I have a lot of things I love to do. Some of them are kind of weird. I like to go to TJ Maxx. I like to go to Marshall's and try to find a bargain. I don't know why. It's just fun. Weird. I like to go to outlet malls. I don't know why. I like to go to ball games. I love live sports, man. I'd go watch any live sport play there is. I'm in Australia and I go see something like cricket. I don't even know what's going on, man, but it's live, man. People are giving it all they got. So what are the things you love to do? And those are the things that the passions of Ikigai. I like to travel. I think it's kind of a funny one, right? My son Brandon and I, we were in Los Angeles. I was giving a talk out there. And so sure enough, we got to go to the stupid Friends couch, right? Some of you Friends fans are like, really? Well, how about that? It was goofy. It was like being a tourist. But the point was, this is one of the things I love. That's on my phone, right? It's on my phone. Travel, friends, my son. That's good stuff. That's a passion. So what I love matters. And you need to know what you love. What about how you see the world? This turns out to be pretty important. How you see the world. What are the values and possibilities of the world? We see this a lot these days. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. And I think that's one of the worries we have about, us older people are worried that if you spend all your time on your phone as a young person, I mean, where's that go? If your attention's all on a single thing, your energy flows there. And does that somehow limit you? So one of the things we do, and this happens, one of the common consultations I get as a psychologist embedded in cardiology is somebody comes to me, they tell their cardiologist, they say, well, how you doing? And the guy or the woman says, I'm doing terrible. And you say, why are you doing terrible? And they say, well, I just don't enjoy anything. What? I don't enjoy anything. Well, how do you fix that? I don't know how to fix that. You know how to fix that? Well, yeah, I do actually know how to fix that. That somehow, when you're not finding pleasure, you've got to figure out what the heart and soul is. So often what we do in the situations like this, particularly around depression and what's called anhedonia, or the lack of pleasure, lack of meaning, we would go and look at a list like this and say, what is the value? What values do you have on here? Which of these descriptions do you put as one of your top values? Now we can end up finding 3 or 5 or 10 or whatever. You can find more than one. You don't have to really decide. I know what mine is. I just happen to say that my number one value of all values on the planet is empathy. And the reason is because I think that when we can walk in other people's shoes, when we can experience what the least of us can feel, whatever that means, when somebody doesn't have anything and you can feel what that feels like, it's very likely that you will do something to make a difference. I think that empathy makes us a species that matters. I think empathy is powerful. The very idea that we have SADs, the very idea that there are people who dedicate their lives to advocating for each of you, that the very idea that you have healthcare providers whose whole life's work is to keep you safe, or people who create medicines to help you. All of these things, these are bedded in empathy. They're bedrocked in empathy, in my view. So knowing what you value, knowing how you see the world, what are your values, and and if you don't know them, when have you done something that other people said, that's pretty cool that you did that. That's pretty cool. You did that. And I think when people say that, I like that. Now, I love empathy. Now, my wife values kindness. So if my wife was on here, she's not on here, I don't think. She didn't tell me she was logging in so I could talk about her. But kindness would be what my wife's number one idea is. She's kindness, kindness, kindness. I find her to be one of the kindest people I've ever run across. But there's a problem with kindness. So we just got out of Girl Scout cookie season, okay? My wife, every single time, no matter where we are in the world, if there are Girl Scouts selling cookies, I know I'm about to buy some really expensive cookies. And I think they're very excited. I think they have our number. I think they have her picture, and they know that she's in the area, and they go like, we got you again. And, downstairs I've got stacks of Girl Scout cookie boxes that we don't even eat them. But she's so respectful of their experience, and it means so much to her to see these young ladies empowered, that this is really important to her. I don't know if that's empathy or kindness, but it sure does result in a lot of cookies. So when we think about a list of values, I don't know what your top values are, but they ought to be in here somewhere. And IKIGAI is about targeting, focusing on what are those passions, what are the ways you see the world, what are the ways that you see blessings or even curiosity. So for example, I kind of like travel and curiosity, and I kind of say like, cool, man, I'm going to Japan. I'm going to try everything. I didn't try that one. I liked everything in there, believe it or not. I mean, most of that stuff's raw. That one there, I got to tell you, I passed on. So I didn't exactly have all the curiosity I thought. That happens to be something that I can smell from here. It is apparently something related to a squid, but I could not get through that one. I had to tell you. I mean, there's some other crazy stuff on here. That one, maybe I don't have as much value on that as I thought. Okay. So what else do we got? What else we got about this IKIGAI thing? I mean, what do you got here? Where can I make a difference? What do you think IKIGAI has to say about that? The idea that all of us have opportunities to give, opportunities to make a difference. And when we're suffering, when we're dealing with anxiety, when we're dealing with depression, when we're dealing with no pleasure from life for whatever reason, it can be very difficult to think about helping someone else. But the very clear finding from research around altruism or the ability to help somebody else, it's very clear that there's massive psychological benefit from doing something for someone else. The way I think about it, there's always these bumper stickers that say like, adopt a pet. And then it says who adopted who. And the point is that doing something for someone else, in this case, adopting a pet, created more return value than the outgoing effort was to help. That your dreams, your possibilities, your opportunities, they're not just the idea about what is your dream, but it may be also people in your life's dreams. And I think dreams are important, particularly because they represent some degree of values. Whether you reach that goal or dream, I think is a little less important than the process that you go at trying to get it. And I wish all dreams turned out the way we always hoped. But even the old show Fantasy Island was about people having simple ideas about fantasies or ideas that actually had dark sides or complications. But the point here is that owning your own dream, helping other people reach their dream, that these are the possibilities. Things like giving back to people, altruism. I mean, this is sort of one of these word salad, word cloud things. And there's lots of ways we can give back. It doesn't have to be just charity. But altruism and making a difference is clearly a powerful way to do that. This is a picture of that was in my hotel room, this idea of stones with hope, gratitude, and love. And again, might sound trite, but taking the time to get these rocks out of a river and put this in them means that somebody wanted this to be a reminder to me and whoever stays in that room and to all of us about these key elements, about looking forward to the future, about how to make a difference in the future, about being grateful for what you have now, and also to express that via love to other people. These are pretty connected. This is much more connected than they seem. Without becoming poetic, it's clearly the idea about Ikigai was cultivating these key elements of how you see the world and where you can make a difference. So we've talked about what I love or what you love, how you see the world, and where you can make a difference. Where can you excel? What are your gifts? People say, I don't know what my gifts are. I mean, go away from me, Sears. I'm tired of this crap. Tell me something better. And I say, but the thing is that what we're good at is probably the things people mention about us. I mean, nobody says to me, hey, good looking haircut, right? But I do know that people say, well, most of the time you give a pretty clear lecture, you dum-dum. And I say, well, thanks very much. I would have loved rock star hairdo, but it didn't work out for me. So capturing compliments about what people say that they like about you is one way of saying maybe that's where my gifts lie, what people notice about me. Not always, but often it's a place to start. And if you're not sure about your gifts, first off, capture compliments, try to write them down. But if you're not sure about your gifts, think about what are the things you're most proud of having accomplished in your life. Those are probably signs and symptoms of Ikigai. That the things that you've accomplished in your life are the sum of a lot of people's helps and dreams. And nobody accomplishes very much singularly by themselves. But the idea of how do you highlight your gifts? How do you recognize in your accomplishments, what did you have in there? So a question I ask to my patients a lot is, what about you helped you achieve that? Okay, but then they always say, well, I went to a great school, my parents raised me right, but what? I say, nope. What about you? What about you helped make that happen? What are the characteristics in you that were the ingredients of success? And what that does is, I think, target that sort of staring directly in the mirror. Like Taylor Swift said, that kind of question makes you look at yourself and try to identify, why did you win? What did you do right? I mean, you're not perfect. No one's perfect. This isn't even about perfection. This is much more about broken pottery that's mended together, but more beautiful than it was when it wasn't broken. So, another way to say is, what are some of the hats you wear? So what are the responsibilities you have? So, you're a dad, you're a mother, you're a brother, you're an aunt, you're an uncle, you're a professor, you're a friend, you're a whatever. What are the hats you wear? Check your fit. Do those fit for you? That's kind of what the kids say now. They say, hey man, rate my fit, right? Fit my check, or fit check. My kids say, like, when I say stuff like this, they can't stand it. But, have a fit check. Rate my fit. How am I looking, man? And I think that's true for our roles. Do the roles fit? Do you like the check? Do you like the fit that are your aspects of Ikigai? So how should we pursue Ikigai now that I've reviewed the elements of Ikigai? Clearly, self-reflection is one of those things. Are you targeting the things that are passions for you and values for you? Is that part of your mindset? And if this talk does nothing else except try to focus or refocus you on some of the things that matter, then we've done something. But it's challenging, I think, particularly to say, okay, I kind of get it, but I don't know how to start. And I think the point is, starting in any direction toward your Ikigai makes sense. That having a positive impact on other people and moving toward an Ikigai is more important than grabbing Ikigai and saying, I have achieved it. In fact, the Japanese would suggest that you don't actually get there. that the meaningful life is something that you pursue on a regular basis, that you recognize the values that you're living with, and that you target the attitudes and behaviors that fit with that kind of ikigai of achieving the quality of lives that you want. So I've thrown a lot at you, and I'm just going to end with a story. I want to end with a story that really moved me during my time in Japan. It's a case study. And the case study is of a dog named Hachiko. Hachiko was I did know a certain kind of dog. And in 1925, Hachiko and Professor Ueno, who lived not far from the Shibuya station, which is the busiest intersection in the world. 2 million people cross it every day. And Professor Ueno and Hachiko would leave their house every morning and go to the train. And Hachiko would go back home. But then every night, when the train came back in at 5, Professor Ueno would get off the plane and get off the train, and there was Hachiko right there at the busiest station in the world. And many people had noticed that, that's weird. The dog and the professor are there in the morning and they're there in the afternoon. And each day, for the better part of 2 years, Professor Ueno went to the station with Hachiko. But then one day, Professor Hachiko went to Tokyo University, and he had a hemorrhagic stroke. Professor Ueno died that day. And Hachiko went to the station to find him, and he never came. And it was noted that for months after that, Professor Ueno's death, that Hachiko went to the station every morning and every night. For 9 years, 9 months, and 15 days, Hachiko would go to the Shibuya station and wait. And many of the people became annoyed by Hachiko. He was always there. Why is that dirty dog always here? 9 years, 9 months, and 15 days. But eventually one of Professor Ueno's graduate students heard about this dog who was always at the station. And so he went to see the dog. And there was a news article written about Hachiko. Hachiko today stands as a statue in Shibuya. A statue of dedication. A statue of loyalty. A statue of love. I mean, did Hachiko find his ikigai? His purpose? He became a superstar. People took pictures of him. And he has become a Japanese legend. Here, my statue with him, and I thought, this is the greatest story I've ever heard about Japan. But it's in part because Hachiko represented exactly what he loved and how he wanted to dedicate his life to who he loved. So I think Hachiko tells us a lot about ikigai. He knew about these things, as silly as it might be. This dog knew what he loved. So tonight, ikigai for your health. What I've tried to do is share with you a few of my lessons from Tokyo. They're just simple ideas about how around the world people seek meaningfulness. That a meaningful life is pursued, probably never exactly gotten. But that pursuit is the meaning. It is the flow. It is the power that drives us. And for that, despite having heart troubles, I believe that ikigai is worth pursuing. And I believe that even if we have some fractures, some pieces of pottery that have been healed, that ikigai is still worth pursuing. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was fabulous. We have about almost 10 minutes that if anyone has questions, please post those in the chat feature and we'll try to address those with Sam. Sam, I heard this talk once at Johns Hopkins. I heard it again tonight. It was even better tonight. I loved it. Fabulous. Thank you.
I practiced. Well, I think it's an important talk from my standpoint because our lives are so busy. I mean, we really don't always have the opportunity to move toward meaningfulness in our lives. Sometimes we're just trying to get through the day, and we all understand that. But I think if you're just always trying to get through the day, you can wind up a year later and not be closer to where you wanted to be. And to me, it's a way of thinking about mindfulness. It's a way of thinking about your thinking. Can we think about what we're trying to achieve? Can we materialize, strategize to have the life that we really want? And I think when we get distracted by the doldrums of life or even the seriousness of life, we can lose track of what we love. We can lose track of what we're passionate for. We can lose track about how we can help other people. And it's totally natural, and no one's blaming anybody, but rather I think Ikigai is a way of resizing that. The other thing about the Japanese culture that's really interesting to me is, so you go to Tokyo and it's a very clean place, but there's 35 million people living there. But the idea here is if you dropped a piece of paper and everybody else did, there'd be 35 million sheets of paper on the ground. And so I think that the degree of personal responsibility to do the right thing, the personal responsibility to know that I affect you and you affect me, I think that's an amazing part of Japanese culture. I also think the respect for other people really matters. I mean, to the point where another important principle from my trip was just the honoring of everyone that you meet and recognizing that, it's not that they have it all worked out, but just that some of these principles have some suitability here.
Okay, so a couple questions. How do we start? What would you recommend as the first step in finding and remembering your Ikigai?
Yeah, I think number one is the values, right? So what do you value the most? I was sort of teasing about my wife being kindness, mine being empathy. I do think that list and you can see these online, you can grab a values list and say, you know what, I really value, for example, another thing I really value is being authentic, good, bad, or indifferent. I think being authentic means that I'm telling you who I am and I'm exposing exactly who I am to you and vice versa. That's pretty powerful, right? I mean, it's kind of scary too. So authenticity is another one. I remember when I was younger, I'd give a speech and afterward I just needed to be consoled. And the reason is because I felt like I had exposed who I was. And if the audience didn't like the speech, they didn't like me. But that's part of being authentic. And being authentic means that you might actually be rejected too. So anyway, that's so I think starting with values, identifying what you most want to be, and then how you might want to demonstrate that value, be it with an action. And I think that's a good place to start. All right, what else we got over here?
Okay, Christy thanks you, first of all. And she said, interesting that anxiety is not related to ICD shocks.
Mm-hmm.
Adrenaline can be related to VT
Mm-hmm.
for some conditions. And she
Mm-hmm.
was shocked in a zombie VR game. Don't ask.
Mm-hmm.
Curious how the bodily mechanisms might be
Yep.
different between anxiety and adrenaline.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I'm aware certainly CPVT is one where we worry about adrenaline. Um, yes, you could certainly have what are called catecholamine surges, which are associated with strong emotions like adrenaline as part of that cascade of things. When we see adrenaline mediated VTVF, typically we're going to put you on more beta blockers. So beta blockers, of course, work by blocking adrenaline. Now, they don't block it 100%, but beta blockers block the chemical signal of arousal that's activated on the heart. So beta blockers do that. That's exactly why we use beta blockers, because beta blockers help us reduce heart rate. No matter what you do, your heart rate won't get as high because you're on a beta blocker. And secondly, because it also reduces the load on the heart. So it makes the heart be able to push blood in an easier fashion. So the point about that slide was not that that's not true for anyone, but in general, on average, that was shown not to be associated with any adverse effects, and it kind of makes sense. A, most of our patients are on beta blockers, and B, if catecholamines or adrenaline caused us all to go into VT and VF, we'd all be gone. The first time we got excited about a football game, we'd all be passed out. So the good news is, our hearts do accelerate in good ways, and only in some very specific conditions do we worry about it, and in those cases, we use medicines.
Thank you very much. Okay, Judy comments, has long QT after suffering an SCAD, which left her paralyzed after 55 minutes of CPR. She's finding purpose is difficult. Any thoughts? She also loved your talk. Thank you.
What a nice thing to say. Well, first off, I admire and respect what you've been through. That's a serious episode and very, very dangerous. So I'm glad that you got out of that danger. Now, how do you find a purpose in that situation? I don't want to be some sort of, seller of rosy glasses here. I think what I'm trying to say is that there's meaning somewhere, and it's often hard for us to find it, but that pursuing it is the answer. Okay, said differently. Maybe what you could do is find a way that you could find one person that you could help that's also dealing with similar kinds of things. I think SCAD in particular has some unusualness to it, both in its incidence and who it happens to and why. So SCAD is actually a pretty complicated because it's just not that common, yet very dangerous. So I think communicating your story is an example of IKIGAI. I think reaching out to somebody who might also have that trouble, example of IKIGAI. I think appreciating what you have each day is an example of IKIGAI. Getting up in the morning and being able to have a cup of coffee or watch the sun or see a flower. I mean, as silly as that sounds, and I know that sounds sort of trite. It's the opposite of trite. It's about meaning. And so I don't know that IKIGAI's got to be, climb Mount Everest. I think IKIGAI can be present with someone you love. Be in that situation where they needed you and you didn't even know it. You just showed up, man. I just came home from work. I didn't know you needed me. Dang. I didn't know what was going on. IKIGAI's like that. It sneaks up on you. Maybe they could call it sneaky guy. That'd be creepy. But IKIGAI is really, it kind of creeps up on you. You don't know where it's coming from. So hang in there with that. I'm so glad you were on the call tonight. And all I can say is hang in there. I think you're probably getting closer to it than you think.
All right. Thank you very much, Sam, for your presentation. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And so I'll wish everyone a good rest of the evening and week. And we'll see you on another webinar soon. Thank you.